So what we're doing today, guys, is we're covering the first two spreads of chapter 12. And in chapter 12, we start looking at what are mental disorders. So if you remember in chapter 11, what we did was we started looking at the concept of mental health and the three types of mental health states. So in chapter 12, what we're doing is we're kind of looking at the contrasting topic to that. We're looking at mental health disorders, or in other words, mental disorders. And we're also looking at the three types of risk factors that we learn about, okay? Remember that in chapter 11, we looked at something called a biopsychosocial model, and we said that there are three types of factors that can affect anyone's mental health at any time. Those are biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. And so what we're going to be doing in this chapter is we're going to be looking at all three of those, but we're going to not just look at the factors themselves, but the risk factors. Again, as we're going to learn about risk factors, any factor that increases the risk, or in other words, increases the chances of developing a mental disorder, or increases your susceptibility, okay, to developing a mental disorder. So that's what we're going to look at for this whole chapter. We're not going to cover it all today, so don't stress. We're only going to cover the introduction, and we're going to cover the biological factors. So that's what our plan is for today. So starting off, we're looking at spread 12A, which looks at something called the 4P model. So if we're looking at, if I say, okay, there are many different factors that can influence the development of, hold on, someone is trying to come in with the wrong name. I'm not letting them in. Okay. If we talk about the factors that can influence the development of mental disorders, what we're really talking about is we're talking about four types of factors. Okay, we're talking about predisposing factors, we're talking about perpetuating factors, precipitating factors, and protective factors. Okay, so if you notice, all of those factors start with the letter P, and that's why, funnily enough, this model is called the 4P model. Okay. The basic idea being that the four factors in this model all start with the letter P. So what you need to be able to do is name the factors, describe what they are briefly, and provide an example for each of them. And more importantly, we need to be able to apply them to a scenario or case study. And we are going to do an example of a scenario question once we've covered the four factors. Okay, so the 4P factor model is what we're looking at in the first spread here. So what is the 4P factor model? Like I said before, it's basically four factors that all start with the letter P. Okay, three of these factors are risk factors. So three of these factors are bad or kind of negative or harmful for us. They increase the risk of us developing a mental disorder. So that's why you've got the cross there, because we want to cross them out. We want to decrease the effect of these. Okay, so these increase the risk of a mental disorder. That's why I put the kind of arrow going up there, or increasing the risk. Okay, let these people in. And the last one is the protective factor. Protective factors are basically factors that decrease the risk. Okay, maybe I'll use green to represent that. Okay, they decrease the risk of developing a mental disorder. So if you've got protective factors in your life, like a proper social support system, or you tend to be quite healthy in terms of you exercise, you have proper sleep patterns, you're going to be less likely to develop a mental disorder because of that, because those factors, in other words, protect you. These three factors though, so predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating, these are known as risk factors because they increase the risk of you developing a mental disorder. Okay, so that's what we talk about when we talk about protective and risk factors. If we look at it in terms of a balance, we always want to have more protective factors than risk factors. However, if our risk factors, which are basically negative things in our life that increases the chances of us developing a mental disorder, if we have too many risk factors more than our protective factors, we are at a greater chance or a greater risk of developing a mental disorder. Okay, that could be any mental disorder, could be depression, could be bipolar, could be schizophrenia, but we are basically at a higher risk of developing that mental disorder there, if the risk factors outweigh or are greater than the protective factors there. So that's the introduction into the 4P model. You're going to come across this terminology very often in questions. Vika often use this as well in their question stems, and we will also be using this. So this should be familiar to you, what we mean by development and or progression of mental disorders. In very simple words, guys, development of a mental disorder means you getting the mental disorder in the first place, getting the mental disorder, I'm going to write MD. Okay, so development is you actually getting the mental disorder, like being diagnosed with depression. Progression is you already have it. So you already have the mental disorder. And progression means that it's becoming worse. So it's worsening, exacerbating, or becoming worse. Okay. So that's what this terminology means. In a question, if we ask you, okay, this person has, you know, this person's mother had depression. How does this factor contribute to the development and or progression of mental disorders? You could say, well, if the person doesn't already have depression, because they've got a genetic link to that development of that mental disorder, there's going to be an increased chance that they will develop that condition. So that's basically what this terminology means. If we put this in a question, we either want you to discuss how the person in the scenario is at an increased risk of getting the mental disorder as a result of that risk factor, or how, if they've already got the mental disorder, how having that risk factor in their life can make it worse. Okay, not all factors are related to genetics. Sometimes a person loses their job. How does that person losing that job affect them compared to someone else in terms of their ability to maybe worsen in terms of their condition? If you've got depression and you know, you've been laid off your job, that's going to worsen your condition. So that's an example of how that factor can contribute to the progression of a mental disorder. So very important to know what that means, because in a question in the SAC, if this question comes up, and in the exam, if this question comes up and you see this terminology, we are not going to be able, or we can't actually explain this for you, because this is something you're expected to know, okay, how to unpack and how to link back to the scenario there. It's a key terminology there. And just like any other key terminology, you need to understand this terminology in the box in red. Okay, so now let's look at each one of those factors individually. So the first one is predisposing factors. Predisposing factors are any factors that increase the susceptibility. Susceptibility just means the chance of developing. Okay, so when I say that someone's susceptibility is increased, all I'm really saying is that the person's chances of getting that disorder or mental disorder are increased. Okay, if you look at this picture, it's a very nice picture of a very symbolic picture of a boy that looks like he's sitting on you know, stairs, but he's actually sitting on DNA, and that's genetic material. Okay, and genetic material, it's related to predisposing factors, because when we talk about, you know, certain mental disorders, like for example depression, they do have a genetic link. So if you've got a mother or father who has depression, or if you're one of like a set of identical twins that has depression, your twin or, you know, your mother or father are going to influence you to have an increased risk of developing that as well. Okay, so that's why we say it increases the risk. However, that doesn't mean that it causes depression. So just because you have a mother or father who's got depression, that doesn't mean that you are 110% guaranteed to have it yourself. So it's not a causal factor, but it's an increased risk factor. That's all. Okay. So that's basically what predisposing factors are. Another example of a predisposing factor that we studied last year when we did attachment styles, and which we'll study later in this chapter as a social factor, is disorganized attachment. So disorganized attachment, I don't know if you guys remember last year when we were doing the attachment styles, we learned about insecure attachment and secure attachment. And we said secure attachment is the good one, but that disorganized attachment is a type of insecure attachment. It's actually a very rare type of attachment and mainly seen in mother-baby relationships that are abusive in nature, okay, where there's a lot of neglect and there's a lot of trauma involved. So disorganized attachment, you can imagine how a child who grows up with a mother who's very, or a caregiver who's very abusive or neglectful, can grow up with an increased chance of developing a mental disorder. What we say about predisposing factors, guys, and what makes it different from the other factors is that you basically have no control over them, or that it's difficult to change your situation. Okay, so if I'm genetically predisposed to develop depression, for example, I can't just go in and change that, you know, that genetic link. I can't change that DNA sequence that might increase my susceptibility to get depression. Okay, same thing with disorganized attachment. You can't help as a baby who your mother is or who your caregiver is. You can't control their behavior. They're the adult in that situation. So that's why disorganized attachment is also an example of a predisposing factor. In each of the slides for the P factors, there's this little analogy we can use about predisposing factors, and we link it back to weather and like rain and sun basically. But when we're talking about predisposing factors, we can think of predisposing factors as being the sun shining. So, you know, as a person who's maybe got a genetic link to depression, a person might look happy on the outside, but the black clouds linger. So you've got the clouds in the background, they're lingering there, okay, which shows us that even though this person's happy, they've always got this kind of like danger in the background in terms of, you know, being genetically predisposed to developing depression at any point in time, okay? And so that risk is always surrounding them, okay, compared to someone who doesn't have a genetic link there. So that's what a predisposing factor is. Anything that the individual can't control or they can't help in terms of being able to change that, okay? So that's a predisposing factor. Precipitating factors are a little bit different. So when you think about precipitating factors, think about the word precipitation. Precipitation is basically rain, okay? So when we talk about precipitation, we can talk about basically the rain starting to fall, okay? And that basically either, you know, there's a new problem that triggers you mentally, or that triggers your mental health to decline, or that an existing problem becomes worse or is further impacted. Okay, so when you think about precipitating factors, just like precipitation, think about the rain pouring down on someone, okay? So you're already down in the dumps, you're already feeling quite, you know, quite bad or quite stressed, let's say because of this whole COVID thing. And let's say that VCAR decide to then move the exams earlier than expected. So not just postpone them, but move them earlier than expected. Okay, that's not going to happen, but, you know, just think about that as an example. If they were to do that, that is an example of a precipitating factor. You're already down in the dumps like this character in this little picture here, but, you know, that new factor or that new problem triggers you to actually worsen in terms of your mental disorder or your mental health condition. Okay, so what precipitating factors are is that they increase your susceptibility to developing a mental disorder, similar to precipitating factors, but they can also contribute to the occurrence of that specific mental disorder. So what we're saying is sometimes a precipitating factor can worsen an existing mental disorder, so adding to it or pouring down on someone's already existing issues. But in other words, a precipitating factor can also directly lead to the development of a mental disorder. So for example, if you were stressed and you decided, okay, I need a holiday, and you went to a country for a holiday, and while you were there and you were still thinking about your worries and concerns back home, you know, that country was kind of, you know, affected by a natural disaster like a cyclone. And, you know, you maybe were, you know, in the midst of that cyclone, and, you know, you lost all your belongings, and you know, maybe the person you were traveling with was killed in that cyclone or whatever. That's going to actually contribute to you feeling very distressed. And that can actually directly contribute to a mental disorder forming, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say precipitating factors can either add on to an existing issue, or they can by themselves contribute to the occurrence. Okay, they can have either of these two functions there. Okay, so just like rain, we said precipitating factors pour down on a person. So in a scenario, you're looking for basically a person's already kind of like struggling, and now something else has been thrown into the ring. Something else has been thrown into the equation. So the person's already stressed about work, and then they find out that the company needs to fire maybe 10 employees because the company is getting bought out by another company. Okay, that is an example of a precipitating factor. It's pouring down on you, and it's potentially going to worsen your existing condition there. Okay, so that's precipitating factors. Perpetuating factors are a little bit more easier to understand. But you know what, the problem is that a lot of the time students confuse the precipitating factors with the perpetuating factors. This is the main way you can differentiate between the two. So with perpetuating factors are any risk factor that increases the chance of, you know, mental disorder development or progression by preventing recovery. That's the key word there. So if you think of any risk factor that stops the person from recovering or stops the person from getting better or getting help, and thus in doing so, it maintains their condition, that is an example of a perpetuating factor. So if we think about our analogy again, perpetuating factors are basically the rain keeps coming, okay, and the rain doesn't stop. There's nothing, the girl doesn't have an umbrella. She doesn't have a protective factor there. So the rain just keeps on coming, keeps on pouring down, and she's not really, you can see in this picture, she's not really doing anything actively there to kind of protect herself from that rain, protect herself from those issues. So you can see that as a result of that, that is preventing her recovery, okay? So perpetuating factors maintain your mental disorder because they prevent you from recovering. So some examples just to make it clearer. If you're, for example, if you've got depression and you're lying in bed all day, which is a common thing in depression, you know, people just lie in bed all day, they don't have motivation to do things they were interested in before. So let's say you've got depression, you're lying in bed all day, you're cutting off contact with everyone around you. People are offering to give you help. People are offering to talk to you. People are offering to send you something, okay? But you're just cutting off contact with everyone around you. That itself can be an example of a perpetuating factor, because by you denying and rejecting everyone around you, you are preventing your own recovery, okay? And that's the key idea behind what a perpetuating factor is. You're preventing your recovery. You're not allowing yourself or helping yourself to, in other words, get better or get help there. Okay, so that's the idea. If we're talking about specific phobias, and we're going to learn about specific phobias in the next chapter, if you've got a phobia of birds and you never go out, you never leave the house, you never go to the beach because you're scared that you'll see a bird, that avoidance behavior is also an example of a perpetuating factor. Because by not going out, by not going to the beach, you're not making it any easier on yourself in terms of your phobia of birds, and the chances of you recovering or getting over that phobia are actually going to be decreased. So you're preventing your own recovery in terms of that phobic stimulus, okay, which is birds. Another example is, and sometimes one that can't be helped as well, but sometimes one that people just can't leave, is an abusive marriage. So for example, if a person has developed depression as a result of being in an abusive marriage, and they decide to, for example, stay in that marriage because they think it'll get better, without thinking about themselves and them being the first priority kind of thing, that would then lead to that also being a perpetuating factor, because by remaining in that abusive marriage, you're not allowing yourself to get any relief from that distress and from that trauma. And in doing so, you are preventing your own recovery. Okay, so that's the basic idea there. That's what a perpetuating factor is. Okay, so perpetuating factors, in a scenario, you're looking for any behavior that a person does that stops them from getting better, that stops them from recovering, that stops them from being the best version that they can be of themselves. Okay, so that's what you're looking for. And the last factor is probably the easiest one for us to understand. That's protective factors. And remember, we said protective factors are not risk factors like the other three we just went through. These are factors that are actually good. We want to increase the amount of protective factors that we have in our life, because they actually decrease mental health conditions, or they decrease the effect of mental disorders. Okay. And how they do that is, number one, they either prevent the occurrence or reoccurrence of that specific mental disorder. So this part basically means, hold on, let me open a text box. The first part of the definition means you don't get it in the first place. You don't get the mental disorder in the first place. Okay, that's what the first part of that definition means. And the second part of that definition means, or allows the patient to gain better control. So you've already got the mental disorder, but you can manage it better. Okay, so that's what that definition means. Protective factors apply for both. That doesn't mean, for example, let's say I have depression. That doesn't mean that I can't be benefited by protective factors. For example, there's no point of me cutting off people in my life and saying, oh, you know what, don't talk to me because I've got depression. I can't get, there's no way for me to get better. There's no way to help myself in this situation. Okay, because protective factors, regardless of whether you've got a mental disorder or you don't have a mental disorder, protective factors are always good for you. Okay, and if we link it back to our analogy of the rain and the sun and the umbrella, okay, sorry, not the umbrella. We haven't discussed the umbrella yet. The umbrella comes up in protective factors. Remember the girl in the previous slide who was sitting in the rain, not helping herself to get better? Umbrella is basically the protective factor in this case. It's protecting her against the rain, and it's decreasing the effect of that rain that's pouring down on her. Okay, the rain symbolizing like risk factors or mental health, influences there. Okay, negative influences on mental health. So in other words, protective factors are really good for us because they essentially protect us or decrease the negative effect of those risk factors, okay? And thus allow us to either prevent developing the mental disorder or to gain better control of the symptoms. So some examples of protective factors include like really general ones, for example, having a strong network of friends and family. Okay, we can talk about having good sleep patterns. We can talk about having a good diet. And these are the ones we'll learn about in chapter 14. Cognitive behavioral strategies, okay, changing the way you think from being a negative form of thinking to a positive form of thinking. We learned about CBT in chapter 10, okay, but it's not just something for sleep. CBT is used widely for mental health as well as social support from friends, family, and the community. Whether that social support is a phone call, whether that social support is, dropping some food off for you or, helping you with your errands or dropping your children at school, anything that will help you and will ease the burden that you have. Okay. So again, protective factors can vary, and the kind of protective factors that you see in different scenarios will be different, depending on the individual in that scenario and depending on what they're going through and what mental disorder or issue they're experiencing. But the one commonality or the one common thing that you'll see in any protective factor is that it's something good. There's some hope there. It's the umbrella for that person in the scenario. Okay, it's basically something that's either reducing some negative effect of a mental disorder they're experiencing or helping that person to cope better or to manage their symptoms of the mental disorder a little bit better than before. So that's the basic idea. Okay, so those are our four factors that we look at. So the first three were the risk factors, precipitating, predisposing, and perpetuating. And the last one is our protective factor, which is the good factor. That's the factor we want more of. Okay. Alrighty. So what we need to do, guys, or what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to know the difference between all four of those factors, and we need to be able to apply them to a case study. So what I want you to do now is I'll give you guys about a minute to read through this scenario and just identify which one is the predisposing factor, which one is the precipitating factor, perpetuating, and protective. Maybe start from protective because it's easier to spot which factors are the good factors that are protecting her or that can protect her against mental disorder related issues. Okay, so I'll give you guys about maybe 2 minutes in total to read that and then identify. And if you have any idea of the answers, just let me know in the chat box. Okay, guys, hopefully you've got an understanding of at least some of the factors there. So we'll start with the easiest one, which is the protective factor. Usually the easiest thing for us to do is to identify the protective factor first, just because it's always easier to see in a very otherwise gloomy scenario or an otherwise scenario where a person is experiencing a mental health issue. It's easy to see what kind of factors are helping them. So can anyone tell me in the chat box, what do you guys think, just in dot points or in a single word, what are any of the factors in Catherine's scenario that are protective, that are going to be protecting her against the effects of a mental disorder, or basically that will help her to cope better or manage her symptoms better? Yep, excellent. Church and the social support. Yeah. So basically it says in the scenario that she makes the time regularly to attend the church with a community that is very supportive. So the supportive community of people from the church, and that acts as social support for her. So she can get advice from them, they can, she can lean on them for help if needed. Okay, so that's kind of the understanding there. Awesome. All right, let's go to the next one. What should we look at next? Let's look at predisposing. Predisposing meaning factors you don't have a lot of control over. Okay, and they are likely to increase your risk. They don't cause the mental disorder to develop, but they do increase the susceptibility. Can anyone tell me in the chat box, what's an example of a predisposing factor from Catherine's scenario? Yeah, excellent. Her family's history of depression. So if we look at the last few lines of the scenario, it says Catherine has a history of depression in her family through her maternal grandmother. So we can just literally copy that down. So Catherine's family history of depression through her maternal grandmother indicates a genetic predisposition or genetic link. Okay. So that means Catherine is likely to increase her own risk of depression because it's already in her family. Okay, there is a genetic link there. All right, now these are probably the most difficult in any scenario for us to identify, but just remember, link it back to the definition. Let's start with perpetuating factors. What's an example of a perpetuating factor in this scenario that's stopping Catherine from being her best self, or that's stopping her from being able to prevent her recovery? Think about anything. And remember, perpetuating factors don't have to be internal factors. They can be external as well. Take a guess. Yeah, excellent. Demanding job. Good work. So we can write that here. So obviously, if Catherine's already experiencing depressive symptoms, but she's still going to her job where she's responsible for a team of 73 employees, and it says it's an extremely demanding role, okay, that's preventing her from recovering because every day she's going back and having to deal with that stress. Okay, so that's why Catherine's extremely demanding job, looking after 73 employees, does nothing to reduce her stress, thus maintaining her condition. Okay, and preventing recovery. Okay, so that's the basic idea for that one. All right, and then precipitating risk factors. So what do you think has happened in this scenario, a sudden happening, or it could be something that just came up that has actually started to make Catherine's mental health issues or mental health conditions a little bit worse? Okay, remember, precipitating factors are factors that happen, could be an event, could be anything that happens, and it just pours down on you. So remember that little picture of the character that the rain was pouring down on him. Think about what in this scenario is an example of a situation that would act as a precipitating factor. that would either contribute to the direct development of a mental disorder or worsen her existing condition. Yeah, excellent. Finding out she has motor neuron disease. Exactly, spot on. So obviously, if you're already stressed and then you find out you've got like a motor neuron disease or any disease for that matter, that's like a sudden blow to you. Okay, that's like, oh my God, like now I've got a mental now I've actually been diagnosed with a disorder. Okay, so that's actually going to increase the chances of your mental health condition worsening, or finding out she has motor neuron disease can actually directly contribute to her developing major depression, okay, or developing another mental disorder for that matter. So what we'll write here is Catherine's recent 3 months ago diagnosis of motor neuron disease. Okay, so that's the basic idea. What I'll do is I'll save this as an image and then I'll upload it to Schoolbox. Okay. All right, so what we'll do is, if that makes sense, guys, this is the basic idea behind 4P model, okay, 4P factor model. The 4P factor model is this basic thing that we need to know the factors, but it's more important for us to be able to link back to a scenario. This is a typical example of a scenario-based question, okay? And these can be confusing, but if you just break it down like this, and you've got more in your Ed Rollo questions as well, and if you can do this, then it's pretty, you're pretty much good for this topic, okay? So that's the basic idea. All right, so let's keep moving on now. We're just going to look, oh, got to rub off all those scribbles. So now what we're going to look at is the biological risk factors. Okay, so all we're looking at is 4 different risk factors and they're all biological in nature. Remember, guys, when we talk about biological factors, we're talking about factors that affect the body or that affect the brain at a biological or neurological level. So affecting like your neurotransmitters or the release of your hormones in your body, all that kind of stuff. Okay, the 4 that we learn according to our study design are genetic vulnerability, which is very much related to whether you've got a genetic link, poor response to medication, which is dependent on whether medication works for you or not, poor sleep, which we already learned about in chapter 9 and 10, as well as substance use, which is basically the use of drugs. And we know that certain drugs can actually induce the development of certain mental disorders or increase the chance of developing those mental disorders. So we're only dealing with biological risk factors in this spread. So these are the 4 again listed out for you. There's no real memory tip that we can do for biological risk factors, but if you spell out the letters they start with, you've got like GPPS, and I don't know, GP is another word for doctor, and doctors tend to deal with a lot of biology related stuff. So you could talk about, you can maybe remember it like that. Okay. So genetic vulnerability, poor response to medication, poor sleep, and substance use. Those are the 4 that we look at. Those are the only 4 that we look at in this chapter, and you need to know them, okay, really well. So the first one is genetic vulnerability. Again, I use the same image as before, just because I really like that image. And also because I think it clearly indicates the kind of helplessness or vulnerability. What does it mean to be vulnerable? It means that you're helpless for your situation. When you've got when you're genetically predisposed to developing a condition, it's inside of you. It's in your genetic material. You can't really change that. Okay, it's sad to say, but you can't change it. So genetic vulnerability is basically the increased chance of developing or increased susceptibility or chance of developing a mental disorder because of factors associated with your genetic predisposition. Predisposition just means predisposed. Okay, that's what we used to call the genetic link, the predisposing factors in the 4P model. Okay, with schizophrenia, for example, or with any mental disorder, a patient who has that genetic link or whose father or mother has it, for example, or grandmother has it, they might not be guaranteed to develop the mental disorder, but if they are exposed to other factors, we call these environmental factors like drug use, the mental disorder may have a higher chance of developing. Okay, and we'll look at a link. I've got an image in this PowerPoint that actually explains this a bit well. Okay, so genetic vulnerability is just another word for genetic predisposition, and how someone is more vulnerable to develop a mental disorder if they are having a mother or a father or a sibling or an aunt or grandmother that has that mental disorder as well. Okay, so moving on to, here's the image that I was talking about. Okay, so this is the image when we're talking about genetic vulnerability. So if you look at it, it's just an analogy using a jar. So here we can see that the red kind of balls, the red dots there represent genetic vulnerability factors. So this is representing your genetics or your DNA, I suppose, that predisposes you to developing depression or schizophrenia or whatever it is. In this case, we're talking about psychosis, which is a common feature of schizophrenia. Okay, so this is the example we're looking at now. Okay, so that's the idea. So in the first example here, we can see that the jar is not yet full. This person is genetically predisposed to developing it, but it's not like they have it yet, okay? Over time though, with environmental factors, for example, maybe this person is taking drugs, okay? And those are the blue stars, okay? This is talking about the environmental influences. Or maybe this person is going through a lot of stress in their life, or they've experienced some trauma, okay? All of those factors are environmental influences that come from outside. They're not our fault, they come from outside. So sometimes they are our fault though, but sometimes they can come from outside as well. Okay, those environmental factors, they combine or they interact with the genetic factors, and they can then contribute to the actual development of the condition. Okay, for example, people that are predisposed to depression who otherwise have a pretty good life, maybe when they get married, they maybe lose their spouse. Maybe their spouse dies in a car accident, or maybe they are kidnapped. Okay, that kind of event is very traumatic, and that's what we called as a major stressor in chapter 3 when we did stress. Those kinds of events can actually cause a person's genetic predisposition from just being an underlying thing that exists inside them to actually becoming a full-blown developed mental disorder there. Okay, so remember, genetic and environmental factors, they do influence one another. And we also learned about this last year when we learned about the nature versus nurture. Remember, we said that sometimes you can be predisposed to get something, but sometimes it's your environment that can actually affect that more so. Okay, so if you've got a gene, for example, that influences obesity, which does exist, that gene might not be triggered unless you are actually also having environmental factors like a bad diet, unless you are also, for example, living in a society where there's not many exercising facilities like gyms or parks to walk in, for example. Okay, so this is more or less the nature versus nurture explanation there. Okay, the next thing that we're looking at is poor sleep. So obviously when a person experiences poor sleep, you don't feel good, okay? Even if you don't have a mental disorder, even if you're a mentally healthy person, okay, for all intents and purposes, you, when you're not having proper sleep, you don't feel good, okay? And this is the cycle. When you've got a lack of sleep, you experience increased fatigue or tiredness, okay? When you're tired, you have difficulty coping with your daily life, okay? When you have difficulty coping with your daily life, you feel bad about yourself that you couldn't achieve what you set out to achieve. And that might give you low self-esteem. Okay, when you have low self-esteem, that would then lead to feelings of worry and stress, which again keep you up at night, and that the cycle continues. Okay, so poor sleep can lead to this endless cycle of overthinking at night, not being able to sleep, and that following on the next day. And this is why we said sleep deprivation has all those different affective, behavioral, cognitive effects, okay, because it does basically stuff up and impair the way that you function. This is a little data I found online. Adults who experience sleep problems are 4 times more likely to develop depression than adults with no sleep problems. And you can understand why this might occur, okay? Because people who are sleep deprived often feel irritable. It's an affective effect of sleep deprivation. They can't fulfill tasks to the best of their ability. They have poor mood and they have difficulty managing emotions. So all those affective effects are basically affected for them, or basically impacted for them. Okay, it's a two-way effect as well. So as we saw in that cycle there, poor sleep can lead to a mental disorder, but a mental disorder can also cause a person to have poor sleep. So it's like a bi-directional relationship or a two-way relationship there. Okay, so that's the idea behind poor sleep. A poor response to medication is this idea that you might have one brand of antidepressant and 2 people take that antidepressant, but it only really works for one of them. Why is it that certain medications only work for some people? Okay, even if we think about really basic medication, guys, we don't have to go all the way to mental disorder medications, but let's think about something like Panadol. Why is it that some people take a Panadol and their headache is gone, but other people have to resort to more high strength things like Nurofen or Panadine or Advil or, you know, other medications? It's because all of us, because of genetic factors, because of factors with reference to things like the way that our hormones are released, the way that our body breaks down the medication, all of those genetic factors can actually influence why an antidepressant might work for one person, but may not work for another person, okay? And basically that's all to do with our genetic link or our genetic factor. So remember the pill and the little DNA sequence that we can see here, okay? And this can obviously lead, when you've got a poor response to medication and the antidepressant's not working for you, this can lead to you going through packets and packets of different types of medications and getting prescribed different medications from your doctor and psychologist. And so you're basically, it's trial and error. You're basically going through so many different medications, basically just to find the right one. Now, how does this all link up to biological risk factors? It links up to biological risk factors because the main reason for why some medications don't work for some people but do work for others is because of genetic factors. Factors inside of us that influence how we absorb, how we metabolize or break down, or how we eliminate some substances within medications, okay? Depending on the medication that you're taking, some drugs actually break down too slowly. What that means is that they don't break down fast enough or kind of metabolize fast enough in the body, and they actually build up or accumulate over time. That can lead to severe side effects. And this is why some people experience intense side effects from taking antidepressants, for example. Okay, in another patient, another person, the drug might metabolize too rapidly. So this drug is breaking down too quickly, even before it gets a chance to start working. So this person has the opposite problem. For the third person, just another example, another person might find that drug ineffective because they actually have a deficiency or an excess of the neurotransmitter that the medication is supposed to target. For example, if you're taking an antidepressant, but you've got, too much serotonin, it's not going to work because antidepressants are helping to improve the serotonin levels in the brain. Okay, this is an example. You don't need to know about serotonin and depression here, but just as an example for you guys, okay? So understanding that different people might have the same prescription of whatever drug it is and the amount that they need to take, but for some people it works with no reaction. These are the lucky group. For some people it doesn't work and it's got reactions for them. So these are the unlucky group. And these are the group that are kind of, this group, for example, it doesn't work, but it doesn't affect them. So they're kind of in the middle. This group, it works for them, but they have reactions from it. Okay, so good efficacy. Efficacy just means whether something is effective or not, whether it works or not. Okay, so just remember what poor response to medication is and what factors can influence our response to medication there. Okay, and the last thing that we're looking at is substance use. So substance use is not just the consumption. A lot of the time when we think of substance use, we think of, okay, someone like, I don't know, snorting a row of cocaine or, smoking weed, but it's not just about that. It's also about other drugs. For example, you can actually, overdose on prescription drugs, and you might hear of like celebrities who have overdosed on prescription medication and have been found lying in their room or a hotel room or something like that. So prescription drugs can be overdosed on as well as the more illicit drugs that we're familiar with from popular culture and media. For example, heroin, cocaine, what else do we have? Ecstasy, all of those are illicit drugs. We can also, substances can also include things like petrol. Okay, people sniff petrol as well in some parts, even in Australia, in some parts of Australia, this is a thing. Okay, it gets you high and it does have an effect on your neurotransmitters and brain activity. That's the main idea, guys. The main idea that substance use is a biological risk factor is because inhaling or taking any of these substances can actually lead to different changes in your brain, specifically changes in the way your neurotransmitters function. For example, the way glutamate or GABA functions, as well as changes in your brain activity, which refers to the excitatory or inhibitory effect. Okay, if the drug that you're taking is affecting an excitatory neurotransmitter in your brain like glutamate, we can expect your brain to become very highly active. Okay, because remember we said that, I'm just going to write neuro-T. Remember we said that excitatory neurotransmitters like dopamine, like glutamate, these actually increase, they lead to very high activity in your brain. So you're super alert and you're super active and aware. Okay, this is the reason why kind of like stimulant drugs, which are also tend to have an excitatory effect in the neurotransmitters in your brain. Stimulant drugs like stimulant drugs like cocaine, ecstasy, they tend to make a person more awake and alert and aware. Whereas your depressant drugs like heroin or codeine, for example, which is found in a lot of your painkiller medication, they tend to make you less aware, and they tend to make you less kind of active. So they tend to relax you a little more, okay? So that's basically the idea, that the substance you take, depending on what it is, okay, can actually affect your brain activity, either having an excitatory or stimulant effect, or having an inhibitory or depressant effect there. Okay, it really depends on what the person is using. In this scenario, if the person is said to be using something like, let's say something like ecstasy, you should be able to know from the previous chapters that that's a stimulant drug, and you should be able to think about what kind of effect that would have on their brain there. Okay, the main thing that we look at, or the main example that we look at with reference to substance use is, and the development of mental disorders is, cannabis, okay, cannabis or marijuana. Now, cannabis or marijuana is basically a psychoactive drug. What that means is that when you take cannabis or marijuana, it actually increases the levels of dopamine in your brain. Now, there's not a lot of research into this, okay? There's still a lot of confusion about what specific neurotransmitters cannabis affects in the brain. But when you smoke cannabis, so far there is some kind of like, probably not super strong research, but something we can go with. There is some research there to suggest that when you smoke cannabis or marijuana, it actually increases the level of dopamine in your brain. If you remember from Parkinson's disease, dopamine is actually an example of a excitatory neurotransmitter. It's involved in voluntary movement, but it's also involved in, high levels of really good mood. It's involved with, emotional regulation and all that stuff. If you smoke marijuana and that leads to the dopamine levels in your brain going way above normal levels, or way high, at a very high level there, that's actually going to give you that high, okay? That feeling of getting high, and that feeling of your brain becoming very active. That's why we call it a psychoactive drug. The problem is that as your brain gets more and more active, so too does the chances of your levels of anxiety going up. Remember, we said that anxiety is about high level activity in the brain. And we're going to learn about this more in the next chapter when we do phobias, because people who have phobias, when they see a spider, and they've got a phobia of a spider, there's a lot of brain activity that starts happening. Like, oh my God, where's that spider going? Can I escape? Blah, blah, blah. So they start overthinking. And these high levels of anxiety are always produced when your brain has high activity, such as when an excitatory neurotransmitter like dopamine is in high levels in the brain, okay? This is what we call as the drug-induced onset of schizophrenia. This doesn't mean that every person who smokes cannabis or marijuana is going to experience schizophrenia. What it means is that if my dad or my mum already has schizophrenia, or it's already in the family, I don't know what I just drew there. If it's already in the family, then it's obviously going to increase my risk of developing, okay? Remember, we talked about the interaction between genetic and environmental factors, nature versus nurture. So if schizophrenia is already in my family and I've already got the risk of the nature there because of the genes, smoking marijuana or smoking cannabis is an environmental factor because it's something that I do, but I manipulate the environment when I engage in this behavior. So environment, okay? Me smoking marijuana or me smoking cannabis is basically going to, influence the development or trigger that gene to actually be expressed. So what this would lead to is the person smoking marijuana starting to experience psychotic episodes or psychosis, okay? And psychosis is characterized by symptoms such as hallucinations, seeing things that aren't there, delusions, thinking that people are out to get you, and basically psychotic thoughts, which are connected to delusions and hallucinations there. We can see in this graph here, guys, this is just an example to show you some data. We can see in this graph here that a person who's got, for example, substance use, which is the black color bars there, the darker ones, you can see that those people experience higher levels of psychotic related symptoms compared to people who don't use them, which are the gray bars, okay? So that's again showing you that these people were affected by, this particular drug use there. Okay, just like sleep and mental disorders, substance use and mental disorders also have a two-way relationship. Sometimes people use substances or they take drugs to escape their worries and stresses in life. But as a result of doing that, taking the drugs actually can also increase your mental health issues, either because you can't afford to keep your drug habit going, or because similar to this, you take a drug and it expresses a gene in you for developing a certain mental disorder. So far, the only mental disorder that has a drug-induced onset, or that we study at least, is schizophrenia. Okay, so this is the only one you need to know. Okay. And this is just, again, from the last kind of page of that spread in your book, just summarizing the factors for you and classifying them as with reference to the P model, 4P model. So we look at genetic vulnerability, as we said before, is a predisposing risk factor. So remember, another word for genetic vulnerability is predisposition. So genetic predisposition makes it a predisposing risk factor. Poor sleep and substance use are precipitating risk factors, because if you've already got stress in your life, poor sleep only makes it worse. Substance use only makes it worse. Okay. And perpetuating risk factor is basically poor response to medications. You're already struggling with depressive symptoms, in other words. And when your body is not responding to the medications, it's actually stopping your recovery. So that's how poor response to medication is a perpetuating risk factor, because it stops your recovery. And because it stops your recovery, it actually causes you to maintain or to continue to live with that specific mental disorder or specific condition there. Okay, that's it for spread 12A and 12B. So we finished right on the dot. Do you guys have any questions? So I'll just stop the recording here.